Joining us now is the Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, Mark Galeotti. A very good morning to you, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us. First question actually relates to what the Defence Secretary told me this morning, John Healey, which is that Ukraine's safety is not diminished post the result of the US election. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's a degree of political sugarcoating there. The thing is that we don't really know what Trump actually intends. Yes, he's made various claims about the fact that he would end the war and so forth. But just as Trump has always demonstrated himself to be unpredictable, there are risks for both Russia and Ukraine in this. So although on balance, this means that it's a much more uncertain time for Ukraine, because at present it looks like he really wants to just try and fix the war with the existing front lines. Nonetheless, there's still 2 months for them to convince him otherwise.
In terms of the appointments that he makes, how closely are you watching those as to what he plans for both Ukraine but also Russia specifically? Over the weekend, of course, he ruled out reappointing Mike Pompeo, who was a former Secretary of State and someone who was quite pro-Ukraine.
Yes, and it does seem to be that he's getting pressure from within his own team, including his vice president, who is quite famously hostile to the idea of continuing a sort of open-ended spending of billions of dollars in supporting Ukraine. Anyway, that Trump is getting pressure to precisely appoint someone who could be regarded as, I wouldn't say pro-Russian, but certainly less keen on continuing the war in Ukraine. And this will be really important because we do know, if nothing else, that Trump is not a details man. To a large degree, he will depend on his team to kind of paint a picture of what's going on and also to actually handle all the various nuts and bolts. So I think this will be a pretty important decision.
There's obviously a lot of talk of a potential peace deal if things go certain ways. And usually the purists in Europe who are pro-Ukraine think that that sounds like a terrible deal. Is there a deal that's plausible that isn't so terrible or not?
Look, if we're talking about a deal that is imposed or at least, shall I say, facilitated, within a matter of months, it almost certainly would have to be an ugly peace deal in which essentially Ukraine is trading land for peace. But more to the point, this could well just simply end up being a temporary ceasefire. The question is, what would stop Putin regrouping his forces and coming back for another round when he thinks that the time is right? So I think the key thing is, look, Trump can impose a certain kind of ceasefire if need be by threatening Kyiv to suspend assistance and by threatening to Moscow that it would actually increase assistance to the Ukrainians. But that, as I said, would just simply be a temporary thing. A lasting peace that involves security guarantees for Ukraine and so forth, that is a very, very complex program which can't be done quickly, unfortunately.
What's the latest on the ground for both sides in terms of their ability to continue going as they are at the moment?
Well, I mean, for the moment, the Russians are grinding forward. They're taking massive casualties. We heard from Sir Tony Radakin, the Chief of the Defence Staff, that the last month was the most bloody for the Russians in this entire war. Essentially, Putin is willing to burn through his human ammunition in order to try and ensure that by the time Trump gets inaugurated, the front lines are as favourable for him. And he's also trying to push the Ukrainians out of their small salient in the Kursk region. In terms of sustainability, look, I think both sides are able just about to sort of hold on. The Russians can't really continue quite at this rate indefinitely, but on the other hand, they have the economy for at least another year or two at something like this kind of tempo. So it's not as if this is a war which is going to grind to a halt any day soon, unfortunately.
In terms of the UK-US relationship going forward, and there's lots of moving parts there, of course, does the UK offer the US a lot in terms of facilitating its international and defence policy, or is it a very one-way relationship that doesn't give the UK much leverage?
No, actually, I mean, we have to recognise that although the special relationship gets heavily over-touted at times, and it does feel that at the moment it seems to be just the right to be able to provide soldiers for America's wars abroad, in practice, the UK it's certainly America's most important intelligence partner. And that matters. It's not something that is visible, but it's really crucial. We do provide a whole variety of different sort of access points that the Americans don't have. Britain is still capable of being an intervention country. In other words, that we can deploy forces far from our own homeland in a way that most European countries, frankly, aren't. I don't want to overplay it. There is clearly a massive discrepancy between American and British security capabilities. But nonetheless, given that America does need allies, it can't be the sort of the world policeman alone and so forth. Britain still does matter.
Mark Galeotti, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you as always.